I'm often asked which memory improvement books would I recommend. And I've got a lot of suggestions, but what if the best writing about memory improvement isn't in a book? What if it's on a podcast or published via Substack? I want to introduce you to Ronald Johnson because I think he is doing some of the best writing in memory at this present moment, and I see every sign that his writing on memory is going to get better and better and better. So Ronald Johnson has put together the Craft of Memory podcast, and he has Craft of Memory as a regular publication using Substack. And I wanted to introduce you to him and give you a sense of the man behind all of this wonderful thinking about the history of memory techniques, how different memory competitors are using memory techniques in particular ways. These are really in-depth, detailed profiles that get to the core of how you can improve your own use of memory techniques. So, without further ado, here is Ronald Johnson talking about his own use of memory techniques and the craft of memory at large. Ronald, you seem to walk a fine line in what I've seen in your work so far with Craft of Memory, both the podcast and your newsletter, which I think people can search for, Craft of Memory and Substack, and that will come up. The fine line I'm thinking of is memory competition and the larger art of memory as a deeply fulfilling personal act. And one of the things that I read we were talking about early on, and I don't know how long ago, this idea that you couldn't teach memory techniques if you didn't have either world memory champion next to your name or US memory champion or whatever. And where are you with that? And how did you get into memory? And then how did you ultimately resolve this tension where, you can speak about your passion about memory and, walk that fine line between, having some special award for memorizing random information versus memorizing something like content from a book or whatever you feel called to do, in your passion with using memory techniques?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I got into memory sports a couple of years ago, and I began to notice that it sort of changed or it impacted my experience of time. And to give an example, think of it like a motorized walkway, right? You're walking briskly on this motorized walkway, and once you get off of this walkway, you begin to sort of stumble forward. You feel this inertia. So in the world of memory sports, I've sort of felt the pressures of always being fast in whatever I did. And I'm not blaming like memory sports. I think the root of it is at my heart. But I would say that I felt this pressure to always be fast. If I were to memorize, I have to do it as quickly as possible. If I read a book, I had to read it and memorize it and to know it. And then when I watched YouTube videos, how to memorize this in X amount of time. When I scrolled through Goodreads, I saw the amount of books that were to be read, and I sort of just felt this pressure of being fast, efficient, and the pressures of knowing. And taking that motorized walkway analogy, now think of it sort of like time. So if we think about it, the clock is an invention, right? And we sort of have this conception of time as something that could be measured into units. We experience this clock time. So think of it as I'm on this walkway of memory sports, and when I get off and I'm sort of dropped into the world of regular activity, I feel it. I feel sort of the inertia of time. And so when I'm not doing anything, I feel I felt this pressure that I need to be productive. I need to be efficient. I need to be doing something. So those were sort of the feelings I had. So I sort of drew back away from memory sports a little, just to think, just to take a look at my heart, to take a look at my motives of, and just sort of understand like memory, like what is the aim of memory, what is the goal of memory, and I sort of wanted to recover this slowness to help me better understand memory. And then your question or your statement about um titles and uh so with memory sports, you have to train a lot. Well, when I say this, I don't want to make a general statement. There are some people who train like 15, 30 minutes a day, throughout a long period of time and are really good. We think of like Alex Mullen and others. But there is this pressure of wanting, or at least for me, I wanted to win. I wanted to compete at the highest level. And so yeah, and I sometimes it felt like it sort of consumed me in a way. And I felt that it was unhealthy. And when I say this, I'm not saying that memory sports is bad, or it's not something anyone can do. But I will say that there are some temptations involved in memory sports that one needs to be aware of, and I needed to be aware of. So yeah, that's sort of my experience.
Right, right. Well, that's interesting. I agree. I certainly would feel tempted to be a different person than I am if I were to go in there. It's just because I don't really have any competitive bone at all. But just you can almost see there's different flavors of competitors, and fortunately, the memory world is typically filled with very, very nice flavors, very kind people like Alex, who you've mentioned, who's very generous and has shared a lot of what he's doing and so forth. So when I was asked to comment to be the commentator at the Pan American Open 2023 memory competitions, they were asking me, why don't you compete? And one of the reasons that I said is, it would just, it's not, I'd have to change who I am. I also wouldn't add any decent competition for them, because I'm not even going to do it in a rigorous way to come up to speed to actually be a worthwhile competitor. So that's sort of another thing about it. You mentioned time, and you wrote about time, which I think is really fascinating. And time, as you mentioned just now, is there's a bit of a manufacture to it. It's invented, and that's one of the constraints that memory competitions use that we don't necessarily have in our everyday life. So when you're memorizing privately for something that you want to learn, do you use time as a constraint to help push yourself forward or shape how much time you're going to spend? Is it 15 minutes a day, or do you have more of an open approach where you allow as much time to pass as need be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Also, when I sort of withdrew to think more about memory, I was also thinking about the diversity of memory.
Mm.
And what I mean by diversity, I mean is not only memorizing numbers, names and faces, images, um, but also and not only using memory techniques or mnemonics, but also enjoying natural memory as well. So I began to think about the relationship between natural memory and mnemonics. Um, so when it comes to personal memorizing, things that um, I've been trying to not sort of have a time limit. Like, let's say I'm going to memorize this in this amount of time. Because I wanted to recover that slowness, as it were, when it comes to memorizing, and to view what I'm memorizing as food, as something that one could eat, that one could savor, that one could enjoy, that one could meditate upon, that one could reflect upon. If I always, it's sort of like going to a dinner table and saying, I'm going to eat this in X amount of time.
Mm.
Sometimes heavier things require more chewing of the mouth. So when I approach different books, I sometimes have to read it over and over and over again, and not just using the memory palace, but also reading it over and over again. I used to be sort of, when I first started memory techniques and learning about the art of memory, I sort of used to be against rote memorization. I used to say, well, why are you doing something that is so ineffective when you can use imagery and the memory palace and the method of loci and so forth. But then as I began to study the history of memory, and also experiencing memory myself, I also saw the beauty in natural memory and the beauty of repetition, even though it may not be the most efficient or the fastest. But there's a quality of knowing that one experiences. So it's sort of like comparing it to the different modes of transportation. So if the goal was just to get from point A to point B, then we all would be flying in airplanes, right? But we have the modes of walking, of riding a bike, using a car, the different modes of transportation, and all of these different modes have different ways of experiencing. So the when you're riding a bike, it's different than driving a car, and when you're walking, it's different than riding a bike, and when you're using a memory palace, it's different than the constant repetition. So I began to experiment with the different ways of reading, the different ways of memorizing, and thoughtful repetition was one of them as well. So
Right. Yeah, that's
yeah,
interesting. Do you know the Kafka story where the man is always taking the train to work, and one day he misses the train, so he grabs a kid from the street and he says, "I need to borrow your bike." And he takes the bike from town to town because a lot of people have to take trains from town to town for their job. Anyway, he rides the bike, and when he's returning the bike, he sees an old man and he tells the old man, "Oh, I can't believe how much more I noticed riding the bike to work than taking the train." And the old man said, "Why don't you try walking next time and see, just how much you pick up, And so you remind me of that. And I think that I don't know that I would necessarily call that rote, but nonetheless, I reread things. One of the favorite tactics that I have is to try to reread approximately one book a month that I've read before, and it's not a rote, but it's a kind of almost a creative repetition in some sense, because I'm creating a path of revitalizing, seeing what wasn't noticed before, riding the bike, if not walking through the text this time, to just savor it sometimes, just to savor it. Now, you cite a lot of really interesting books in your writing on your newsletter, the Substack Craft of Memory. How do you find so many interesting, wonderful reading materials?
yeah. Well, I read a lot on Substack, and the writers tend to quote and reference different authors, and I sort of I try to read everything that my favorite writers read.
Mm.
So one of my favorite writers is L.M. Sakassis, and he writes on the philosophy and history of technology. And so I reread and read his Substack and his book, The Frailest Thing, as well. And I sort of take a list of all of the authors that he mentions, and then I read them. And also, I'm into urban planning. So when I read books like Jane Jacobs or Jan Gehl or John Gehl, I take a look at the bibliography, and I just write them down, put them on a list, and I read them. So that's one of the ways I discover new authors.
Perfect. So it's like building a phalanx from the shield that you have. I don't know if you know that term phalanx. It's, when the soldiers get their shields together and the spears just go straight over because the 15 soldiers have all their shields interlocked. So, what I mean is you find one book and then you figure out what that soldier is reading, and then you get another shield and another shield, so to speak, built from the singular text. Well, let me just pause on a little bit of a deviation here, because it's a bone that I want to pick with the world. And I'm not doing it to you, but you just corrected your pronunciation of a name, or you attempted to reconfigure it somehow after the fact. And earlier you said loci, or loci, maybe you said. I'm not even sure, I wasn't tracking it. But one thing I get all the time on my YouTube channel is people will be saying, well, you pronounce nuclear incorrectly, or you pronounce this word that way, and it's just like pronunciation police all over the place. So I'm not at all policing your thing, but what do you think about that? Because it is a thing in memory. We memorize things, and there are often so many pronunciations. Like it can be that it's loci, 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 loci. Are we talking about Attic Greek? Are we talking about, a Latin speaker who's using some sort of Greek that's been modified in northern Italy? They've never actually heard Greek, and so forth. What do you do? How do you decide? How do you approach the whole thing about pronunciation? And I just find it fascinating. When I started to learn Latin, I was like, well, what should I go for? Vulgate, or should I go for ecclesiastical pronunciations and all this sort of stuff? And the teacher told me, she said, no matter what you do, people are going to be, she didn't use this term, but they're going to police your pronunciation. So, flip the dice and go with the one you like. And then still, watch out, because there's all kinds of people with opinions. So how do you navigate that?
Is this in the realm of mnemonics or just pronunciation in general?
Well, I think it can't be one or the other, because we, as custodians of memory, we have to talk, we have to speak. We're going to need to correct ourselves, sometimes in real time. Other times it's going to fly over our heads. Plus, there was a time you and I recorded something for your show, and I think I said Hugo of St. Victor because I'd used a friend named Hugo as the mnemonic, and I kind of knew that I fluffed it as I said it, but kind of still kept moving. I said, whatever that guy's name is, or something like that, right? And at that time, I then went and did penance, and I, read in the vineyard of the text, and then I memorized omnium expedendorum prima essentiae in qua perfecti boni forma consistent. And then I went and read, what do you call it? Didascalicon. And I don't even know if I pronounced that correctly, this sort of thing. Because I'm just like, whipping my back because I made a mistake on your podcast. Like that's one of the ways that I deal with that kind of stuff. But I think it's just an issue with no answer, but I'm curious what you think, because as custodians of memory, do we memorize all the possible pronunciations? Do we, extend maximum patience to people who clearly they're not really switched on to it? Because why would you ever correct anyone anyway? Because how could you know? How could you be the person who has such a vast knowledge of all pronunciation that you get to be the one who polices it? Maybe I sound a little bitter, but like I get this almost every week. Somebody saying that I have pronounced something incorrectly, which has the assumption that they are, the person who holds the knowledge of all possible pronunciations. And I'm just curious, from a fellow person who memorizes and I seize upon the loci thing precisely because that's one of the things that I hear again and again and again. Well, it's actually this way. Is it really? Is it? Is it Attic Greek we're talking about or what? So I'm just curious. Put the nail in this coffin.
Yeah. Yeah, when it comes to using terminology and mnemonics, I tend to use what is commonly used and understood.
Mm.
So if I hear something commonly pronounced a certain way, even though it may not be the correct way, I would use what is commonly used and understood by others. So some people would use the term station opposed to locus. So if I were speaking with them, I would try to adapt my language in a way in which they would understand what I'm saying. But in regards to pronunciation in general, I am concerned about pronunciation. So if I'm learning a language, I would want to uh, pronounce the words correctly, at least to the best of my abilities. Um, One for being better understood by those who are listening, and also I'm just I care about the beauty of languages and the way a language sounds, and I care for the pronunciation. So if I'm learning, I would want to pronounce it correctly. But then again, it also depends on context. So if I'm speaking to English speakers and I have like an Italian term or another foreign language, I would use the American pronunciation of that Italian term in a way that the speaker can understand.
Right,
Um,
right.
so yeah, that's my approach.
Cool. Well, thanks for riffing on that. Back to time and maybe time and technology. You have expressed an interest at different points of writing history of, say, memory competitions, and you've done a little bit of writing on various technologies from a historical angle. What interests you in those particular aspects? The memory softwares, the competition as having a history and so forth. What draws you to those aspects that tell a story, certainly, but what interests you in the story?
Yeah, what interests me is it was once said that the essence of technology is nothing technological. Um, and I think that says a lot. And what I mean by that is when we take a look at the things that we tend to pass by, let's say the clock on our computer, or let's say a vacuum or a microwave, or we can even think of sidewalks. Any and I like to ask the question, how does this technology sort of shape or my experience of in different aspects, and what are some of the human values, or um or what if some of the human elements involved in a tech in a particular technology. So I begin to ask questions because I want to be aware of how it's impacting me, or and I don't believe in a technological determinism, but I do believe that we should exercise a level of self-awareness.
Mm.
Um, so that is the reason why I'm interested, is I want to develop a better self-awareness and navigate these questions on how to use technology in a healthy way. Um, so I would say that's for me. And just to give an example, think of a hammer, right? So a hammer It's not good, it's not bad, but it's also not neutral, right? So you can use a hammer to nail a nail, or you can use a hammer to bang someone on the head. But with the hammer in your hand, uh, sort of the reality is sort of you objects are seen as things that could potentially be banged on by the hammer. So the same thing with other types of technology. We have to consider. So that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in memory and technology. So how does the outsourcing of technology to, let's say, Google or search bars or to artificial intelligence, how does that affect our experience, our relationships, the way we navigate in the world? How does it impact us? So I like to ask those types of questions. Um, so yeah, I would say that yeah, I this is a recent development, recent interest. So I'm still asking questions, reading a lot, and seeking to learn more.
Well, I think that's a beautiful line of inquiry and a very important one for your research and anybody listening. His name's Bernard Stiegler, I believe, but I used Stieglitz in Berlin to help me remember that. So hopefully it's Stiegler. I'll look at my shelf here in a minute. But he wrote a book, I think, called Time and Technics that you might want to look at. It's actually a series. And one of the ideas that he brings up is the difference between the potentiality of a thing and then the actualizing, which, you know, you're sort of saying hammer is not neutral. If it's in a hand, then it has the potential to do this, that, or the other thing, and then actualize. But also another thing that he talks about is intention. And he talks about Prometheus as being sort of like the forethought. Here, let's give fire to the gods. But he says that people forget the story because Prometheus had a brother, Epimetheus, and Epimetheus was apparently, you know, Prometheus had the forethought to say, hey, let's give the humans an intention for what to do with the gift of fire. But he gave the job to his brother Epimetheus to give humans the intention. Here's the purpose for the fire, right? But Epimetheus forgot. And I think Epimetheus basically means afterthought. And he only thought after that, yeah, maybe I should have paid more attention to this to-do list and given them a purpose for the fire. So where do you think that works? And I want to tie this into something else that you sort of talked about, natural memory versus, you know, kind of designed memory. I think you use that term, designed memory, in your writing. But just generally, like, where do you think purpose should come from? If there is no any kind of thing that's thrust upon us, there's no determinism in technology, how do we figure out our purpose for anything, for not only the tools we use to memorize, but what we choose to memorize? Here comes the heavy stuff.
So you're asking a question of purpose.
Well, if the technology isn't determining anything, how do we work out? We've got the gift of fire, and Epimetheus has forgotten to give us a purpose. You know, how do we work it out?
Well, I think this is a matter of a worldview, of ethics. This is a very nuanced question that I think it requires a lot. But I would say for me, I come from a Christian background, from the Protestant tradition. So I believe that the purpose of humanity is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. So I would say, with everything I do, it's aimed at towards love of God, love of people, and and human flourishing. So I would say that sort of that's the way I try to navigate the world, is how can I best use technology for the glory of God and for the good of others. So there's a lot of ethics involved and a lot of moral questions, and I know that people listening may come from different religious backgrounds, or perhaps atheistic or agnostic backgrounds. But in regards to me, that's the way I approach it.
So I can see how that would definitely ground a person, give people foundation, and it's a wonderful thing for people to have that. And in some sense, I don't think that atheism is a religion either. Often people say, "Oh, well, atheism is just another form of belief, or science is a form of belief." But nonetheless, I mean, we use our words to help us navigate the world, and it provides some sort of foundational grounding, if only through reference. So I think it's kind of irrelevant what people believe. I think that there is determinism in our memory itself, because one would be born into the world, they would discover a particular system of thinking one way or the other, and then they would discover another one, and they maybe bounced around like balls, and something makes sense, it changes their mind, they think it through, or they don't think it through and they just accept it without criticism. Do you find a determinism in memory yourself? Because you said to me, "Hey, you got to read In the Vineyard of the Text by Ivan Illich." And I was like, cool. So I read it, and it sends me off in a new direction. Now, you could say, well, you chose that, but I think that that's absolutely proof of determinism, if not the absence of free will, because I didn't know you were going to tell me to read that book. I didn't even know I was going to respond to it. And I sure as heck didn't know that it was going to be like, wow, look at that Latin phrase. And then I memorize it, start to think about it, make all kinds of connections, and sends me off in a different direction. So if there's no technological determinism, do you feel that there is a memory determinism, or do you think of it completely differently and no determinism at all?
A memory determinism, that's an interesting phrase. Well, I think when we think about something, due to the associations we have, other memories are triggered. So I could be thinking about one thing, and then a memory of something else could come to my mind, and then I begin to think upon that. And it's sort of this network of ideas in which you are led to think of other things through this web of association. So yeah, I would say that's my view on that.
Right. Okay, one more little philosophical thing, and then I want to get into the shed with actual mnemonic techniques and pick your brain a little bit about memory palaces and linking and all that sort of stuff. So I hear you today, and I've read from you this idea of natural memory versus designed memory, I think is a term that I read you use. And this is not a combat sort of thing, but rather just to push back a little bit, because I think completely differently. And I can't imagine anything more natural than using your imagination to make links, to associate. So I just wonder how that you come to that, and then how you I guess this is the determinism question looked at from a different angle, because it would seem to me that if you come across memory techniques that exist in the world, that would be the most natural thing, because it's humans sharing through relationships, through networks, the alphabet essentially, and just looking at the alphabet a particular way. And then the alphabet appears, you use a pencil to draw it and so forth. The pencil comes from somewhere in nature, so forth. So what do you mean by designed memory, and how is that activity divided somehow from reality as a production that's just ongoing, that's somehow not natural. I mean, maybe that's too much intellectual noodling, and there may be just some very useful semantic division here. But myself, it just, I just think, how does that work out? I can't think of anything more natural than just hearing about a thing, getting into it, using what's in the world and using the brain, than that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, when I made the distinction between natural memory and designed memory, what I was referring to was more, so when I use the term natural memory, I would say without the use of technique. So, um, uh, where there's not this intentional act that I am going to create a memory palace, I'm going to use the peg system, or I'm going to use the major system, or I'm going to link these together. I'm going to sort or sort of designing or structuring or using spaced repetition, or so when I say natural memory, I'm referring more to the natural memories that come of being in the world, the three-dimensional life, like when
Right.
you're having a conversation at a dinner table. I don't go home and then create a memory palace for that conversation, or put it in a flashcard deck.
Right.
Well, you can do that if you want to, but so that's what I was referring to.
Right, right. Yeah, there's certain people who do want extreme autobiographical memory, and some of the uh, people who have so-called hyperthymistic syndrome, often when they study them a little bit deeper, their so-called photographic memory is coming from a kind of OCD level amount of journaling. So superior autobiographical memory is kind of a little bit controversial, so to speak, and yeah, I can see that as being a nice division. Things that you just happen to absorb versus taking a technique and deliberately applying it. Okay, so speaking of that, what do you find is your favorite technique, or is it a combination of techniques? Where does the memory palace sit in your practice? Do you have a 00 to 99 PAO? Like, how far down the rabbit hole have you gone with developing systems? And how do you approach all of that?
Yeah, so I have a two-digit system, a three-digit number system. Um, I use the memory palace. I use the peg system, first letter method. So I've experimented with a lot of systems and different methods. When it comes to memorizing, in regards to what is my favorite, I would say it depends. Um, so I know. Yeah. So there are some things, let's say certain texts that I want to memorize, word for word, or sometimes I won't use a memory palace, or I would just repeat it over and over again. And it's sort of that chewing that I enjoy, that that reflection, the pondering, the tasting. But if I want more of like an organizational structure to my memory. So for example, when I memorize poetry, I I use the memory palace. Um, and so I have a memory palace, sort of like an index where I have A, B, C, D, E, and so on. So like if it's Emily Dickinson in the E, or if it's Williams Wordsworth, um, it's in the W, or if it's Yeats, it's in the Y, and I would go to that particular locus, and I'm able to um, go to that poem, and I like level of organization.
Hmm.
Um, so I also use the number system in conjunction with the memory palace as well. So I'm able to jump to a particular line or go forwards or go backwards. There's some times where I don't use numbers. So it all depends on sort of what is the scope, what is the aim, what are some of the things that I want when I memorize a text or something. So yeah.
So if you're on a station, just use that word. About how much would you put if you're memorizing a poem? You put a line or a word per station, or does that also depend?
Yeah, so I would say it also depends because if you're memorizing a line from Dante, the lines are very short. But if you're memorizing another poem, another text, that a line could be very long. So I am mindful of the amount of imagery that I have in a locus, because I don't want to crowd the images or to have too much imagery. I like to have this sense of space, which for me brings this sense of mental clarity, or I would say the eye's clarity. If you were to think of it as a mental eye, if I were to look into a memory palace, I want to be able to see clearly and not to have the images crowded, because it allows for me to have, at least for me to have easier navigation and recollection when things aren't crowded. So if it was a long line, I would divide it into different parts, and I would put my image for number one from my number system on that locus. And then let's say I would use the first part of the line on locus or station number one, and then I would go to station number two and then put the other part of that first line, and then station number three, and then I would put the final part of that first line. But I am still able to navigate it because it's anchored in the number system.
Hmm.
But I do like to have one line per locus if possible.
Right? Yeah, that I find that it's generally best too. Although I typically end up splitting them somewhere in the middle, depending. Do you tend to write, so to speak, place your imagery, your associations horizontally? Do you sometimes do diagonal, vertical? Is there a fixity there, or how do you proceed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I am mindful of the directionality of the loci. So I try to have a movement that is most natural to me. So if I were to go into a place, I ask the question, what is the most natural movement in this place? And it tends to be in this very this circular motion. So I tend to go in a circular motion. And also I try to have variety in terms of height. So things that are low, things that are high. Also the space. I think about the space from one locus to another locus. I think about that. Um, Also, I try to have around five, or something that feels comfortable in each section of the memory palace. So yeah, I tend to have that circular motion, which is the most intuitive and natural for me.
So, do you mean moving through a room as if it's clockwise or counterclockwise,
Yeah, exactly.
as opposed to you're here at the door, and then you go over to the couch, and then you're on the TV knob, and then you're up at the lights, and then yeah. So, okay,
Exactly, yeah.
that's pretty much how I operate because I don't want to be thinking about memory palaces. I mean, do you have suggestions for people? A lot of people say, "Well, I have to learn all these journeys," and I say, "What for? I mean, why wouldn't you base your journeys on what's already in your memory, and then just use logic like a circle or a clockwise, counterclockwise structure, Do you have opinions or experiences with that where you would say, oh no, you can definitely memorize locations? Do you do anything like that, or do you tend to just use what's already in memory?
So I tend to be very thoughtful when it comes to like what places I use. I view it much like in art. So as like a photographer, they would travel a long distance to either capture something beautiful. I see nothing wrong with traveling and going to find a memory palace to use in order to memorize a text or of anything, because it's the most fitting or the most suitable for the thing that you're or memorizing. Because I also like to think about reflection, like what causes me to reflect. So going into a cathedral is different than going into a corner store. There's certain feelings that you get or certain associations with the place. So so let's say for example, if I want to be invited into a text, right? Um Sometimes I would use a house of a hospitable friend, a friend where I remember where I have a lot of memories of food and of good times, of conversation and hospitality. I would use that as the location if I wanted to communicate the sense of to invite me to reflect upon a text. Or if it's something I really want to consider, I would use, let's say, a restaurant where I had a very good meal that was tasty. So if I had a section that I really wanted to savor, I would use a restaurant in which I recall and have memories of a very good meal. So as I'm approaching that text, I'm invited to eat that text. So I'm not all about forgetting memory palaces. So some people say, well, I think there's nothing wrong with forgetting, but also it depends on your scope or your aim of memorizing. But some people say when you memorize, sort of your memory palaces fade away and they go into the background and you don't remember them anymore. So I tend to want to keep my memory palaces in my mind, and I insert symbols and imagery. So I would put a painting, or I would put a certain music that was touching to me in a location, or I would put a tree, and um or I would put things that help me to think of other things. Um and and the thing is, I'm concerned with the also the aesthetics of the palace. So I just don't want to make them bland, but also want to make it enjoyable to visit these palaces. And if I find it enjoyable and delightful and there's this aesthetic quality, um, there's this increased delight also in the memorizing as well. So
Right.
that would be my advice.
Well, that's interesting. How much of that is influenced by your interest in city planning?
I would say a lot, a
What's
lot.
wrong with our current way of designing cities? Is there a historical example where you would say those people got it just right and we need to return to that? Or do you think there's still a formula yet to come?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in urban planning. I'm still learning, so I don't want to say like this uh is is wrong, and but there are certain things I've read that made me think, um because urban planning is very complex. It's there's a lot of things to consider. I but I would say one thing would be the uh, cities tend to be very car centric or built around the automobile, and this has an impact upon cities, especially in regards to our social interactions, and also the walkability of cities. So I live in Orlando, and uh, things tend to be very far away. So if I wanted to go to the store uh, to get some food, I just can't walk to the store. I have to use my car. I mean, I can walk, but there's it's far away. Or the you think about the transit. Uh, there's no buses, or so it's so I would say building things around the car has also impacted our cities in terms of our interactions and forming and developing relationships. Um, so when I thought of that, I thought about, so just as you have public space, I was also thinking about memory space, as it were. How could I design a memory space that was conducive for interaction, or face-to-face interaction, but in but more so with face-to-face interaction with the text that have memorized, or what are ways that can help me to think and to slow down. So we have something that traffic engineers call stroads, and a stroad is a combination of two words, street and road. So a road is meant to get you from point A to point B, whereas a street is meant to slow you down. So in streets, there tends to be overhanging trees. It's a little more narrow, whereas roads, they're more wide. There's a clearing path. It's straight, and it's made for speed, for getting from point A to point B. But a lot of the times in American cities, we have stroads where it's neither a street nor a road. And so what I try to do is I try to put traffic calming features in my palace, things that cause me to slow down and to get out and to walk and to consider and to ponder ideas and texts and literature and so forth. So I would say, yeah, urban planning has definitely influenced the way I think about memory palace design. And so, yeah.
Well, I'm all for slowing down, and I think that you're doing great work, and I can't wait to read future articles that you're putting together. And I would just say power to you, and thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for this conversation. It is a blessing and a gift to think through your approach to different issues like crowding and some of the philosophy that we got into. I appreciate it very much, and I will continue to remember this as my own form of slowing down in the future. And I love this idea of the strode. I haven't heard that one before, so that's something to look up and also consider. So, where can people find you? What do you have on? Do you have any idea of what you're going to publish next on the Craft of Memory Substack? And what should people do to connect more with Ronald Johnson?
Yeah, so you could find me on Substack at the Craft of Memory. So the craft of memory.substack .com. And you can also find me on Spotify and the different podcast platforms. You can search for the Craft of Memory. But if you want more engagement, I'm most active on Substack. There's a notes section. It's sort of like Twitter, and also you can leave comments on my posts. And my the next post I'm working on is called Memorable Cities, Musicality, and the Mnemonics of Place. So I'm considering a lot of uh, these ideas of space and relationship to memory. How is a city memorable, or how does it how does it become memorable? What are some of those characteristics that we find? So yeah, you can connect with me there, and yeah, that's where you can find me.
One last question pops into mind. Speaking of roads and streets and stroads, you mentioned today Yeats, you mentioned Dante, and Dante, of course, starts the Inferno with a feeling of being lost, trying to find the path, the way, road, street, whatever it is. If you are addressing someone who is feeling lost in all of these endless constructions of streets and roads that make you go faster than you would like to, is there one thing you would recommend a person memorize in their memory palace that is worth pausing upon, that you think, if you were the boss of the world, would be a corrective that would help give people solace and peace, wisdom, that they could memorize? Would it be Dante? Would it be something from Yeats, or something that you haven't mentioned yet?
I would recommend an essay by Haddon Turner. It's called The Burdens of Speed. I would say you wouldn't have to memorize the entire thing, but I think there's very insightful points in that essay that will help us to think about speed and the burdens of speed. And when I say this, I want to clarify. I love memory sports. I'm a fan of memory sports. I'm actually going to uh, or I plan to watch the USA competitions, and I go on Memory Sports TV, and you can find me in the comments. I have a lot of friends in the memory sports world. So, and I encourage people to participate in memory sports. It's a beautiful thing, a beautiful community. So when I say all this, I want to clarify that I'm not against speed or going fast or wanting to memorize and hone a craft. But what I would like to communicate is to be aware of some of the temptations that may be involved with going fast, and sort of take a look and to have some level of self-awareness of how it's affecting your experience of time and your relationships. So yeah, so I would say that.
Oh, I think that's beautiful. And thank you for suggesting that piece. And also thank you for that qualification, because, when I think about it and my recent experience observing the Pan American Open, they may be going fast in their memory, but they're also slowing down and pausing to be with information and memory itself and bring those things together as something that is effectively timeless. And I often ask people this question, came up just today on Art of Memory Forum. I just said, is time really something that exists in the mind of the great memory masters? I'm not sure that it does. I think that there's a complete oneness with information that's possible, and the memory competitors show us that, that it's just it's there is no spoon kind of moment in the Matrix. So yeah, thanks for raising that different way of thinking about the competition, because I think that there's a timelessness to it that they display in terms of really seizing upon what information is, what memory is, what it can be. And even if the clock's on, it is a very different way of thinking about chronology in almost every respect. So thank you again for all these points and suggestions.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor. I'm a fan of your podcast, and I appreciate the work that you do, and keep up the good work.
Likewise, keep going. I'm a fan of what you're doing. So wonderful to be collaborating on this conversation. I want to thank Ronald Johnson again for being on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. As I've mentioned, he's an incredible writer. We writers, we need your support. So if you're interested in memory, make sure you look him up both on his podcast and his writing. And I would especially highlight his writing. It's absolutely fantastic. And it's on Substack under the rubric of Craft of Memory. Thanks as always for joining me for another episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Can you believe it's been as long as it's been? I think it was, just the most amazing adventure. I never would have known that it would never cease when I started it. back in the day, and it's always been a pleasure to hear from so many of you who have been listening to it since the very first episode. So if you have suggestions for what you would like to hear on future episodes, always get in touch. And until we have a chance to speak again, come and visit me at magneticmerrymethod.com if you haven't been before, and keep yourself magnetic.